One singular hour. It's a period of time that can feel very different depending on the context you present it in. For a movie, 1 hour is pretty short, but if you're blinking, a whole 60 minutes might feel a bit too long. Wake up, man, we're about to leave. For the last time, I am not sleeping!
It doesn't take a genius to tell you that the first hour of a video game is extremely important. I'm sure that when the topic of great openings to video games comes up, every person has that extra special title that comes to mind, something that they remember hooked them almost instantly, and never let go after the fact. But what if it eventually did let go? Some may chalk that up to the game simply not staying consistent after its initial introduction, which can definitely be true, but in some cases I'd like to butt in and overcomplicate that by saying that it may have been because of the groundwork, or lack thereof, that was laid during the crucial first hour that led to the game's eventual fall-off. That's not the only reason I want to talk about the initial 60 minutes though. Sometimes it is as simple as the preliminary 24th of a day driving people away, and not planting some evil seed inside of them that makes them magically quit 15 hours later instead. Because of this, I also want to take a look at the differences in the elusive first hour across different genres, types of people, and situations, and discuss what actually makes it so important. Now, obviously, the first hour of a game didn't always matter nearly as much as it does now, mostly because that first hour used to literally be the entire game. A bit later down the line, things started to flesh out a little bit, but it usually was nothing more than, "Oh man, where'd all my bananas go?" Partway through the 4th generation of consoles is when we finally started to see the rise of the video game intro. Stories and exposition were becoming more and more common in games, whereas before they were only in a select few titles, and as a whole, games were getting longer in general during this generation.
Whoa! He's right!
And stories are one of the biggest reasons this conversation even exists. Instead of just silly little adventures that took place in a vacuum, we now have the advent of entire worlds or even universes built around the premise of one single game, which leads me to my first point. Preferences. Obviously, not every game today has an overarching plot and fleshed out universe full of extremely deep characters and lore. That is merely a property that a game may or may not have, just as much as if the developer is, for instance, choosing the abilities of the player. Different types of games exist because different types of people exist. Everyone has a preference, or you may simply be indifferent, which in that case, aren't you special?
What are you looking at me for?
Some people may like a slow burn with their game, being gradually immersed into the universe through world building and exposition, meeting the characters and seeing what the true catalyst is for the story being told in the first place, while others couldn't give less of a shit. They just want to be thrown directly into the action as soon as possible. Now, obviously these two theoretical examples are on opposite ends of the spectrum, and any given game can fall anywhere on that spectrum. So, a simple question to ask in this scenario would be, which of these do you value more, gameplay or story? But unfortunately, that question comes with a lot of nuance. You can like story in some cases, but not in others, or you're fine with story, but think it should play a smaller role in that specific game overall. For example, you may not mind story when playing a Zelda game, but when you're playing Mario, it isn't really something you're interested in engaging in, and in turn feels like a nuisance when it's present. There are so many routes you can take with this question, and that's simply because, well, humans are complicated.
What? I thought you liked goldfish. You idiot! I only like them on Thursdays!
In some games, gameplay is even minimized in favor of a heavy focus on storytelling in a way that isn't really comparable to any other style. A great example of this would be in Detroit Become Human, where gameplay is reduced to quick-time events, dialogue choices, and various low-pressure tasks in a relatively controlled environment, with the main focus of the game being the choices you make and how they affect the events of the story. You could even think of this genre as a sort of middle ground between a movie and a video game. Because of all of this, there is not a single game on this earth that will hook and keep every single player in that first hour. However, luckily people are smart enough to gravitate towards the type of games they enjoy the most, which means in the case of the design process, you're really only catering to a specific group of individuals. Or rather, a specific group of individuals with a certain preference at the given moment that they play your game. As another point, depending on the genre, players are far more lenient when it comes to just how dense the first hour actually is. For something like an RPG, you go into it expecting at least a little bit of story exposition before you get to do any actual playing of the game. The first Xenoblade Chronicles game, for example, has roughly 6 minutes of cutscenes before you even gain control over your character, and that's only for a short introductory battle sequence. The game doesn't actually give you the full freedom to move around where you please until about the 15-minute mark. That's 10% of the initial hour for the first cutscene and 25% of it until full freedom. That's obviously nowhere near the most extreme example, though most RPGs do tend to hover around that threshold, such as Dragon Quest XI, which takes roughly 9 minutes before the player gains control. Now compare this to something like New Super Mario Bros. U having you into the first level in under 2 minutes, the difference is definitely apparent. And with RPGs, it's not really even fair to count the first time the player gets control as the game actually starting. It's likely that there's plenty more long-winded cutscenes sprinkled in after that, and of course, the tutorials. Lots and lots of tutorials. In this game, you can move your character.
Yeah, I gathered that.
I want to cite Mario and Luigi Dream Team here as the absolute worst offender of this I've ever seen. It's not even the first hour, but the first several hours. You are just bombed with tutorial after tutorial, with most of them simply insulting your intelligence. The thing is, the game is amazing once you get past all of these, but for the first few times I've tried playing it, I ended up quitting the game early because of this excessive hand-holding. However, the isolated fact of whether a game takes 2 minutes or 22 minutes to truly begin isn't really relevant here. That's because people go into them with a certain set of expectations. When I open up a puzzle game, for instance, I'm not expecting a huge long exposition on how one day the puzzles materialized in this universe, imprisoning the citizens in an endless cycle of brain teasers just to live out their lives. Tasks as simple as making coffee in the morning were locked behind a randomized series of bewildering riddles and conundrums, which eventually exiled the less intelligent citizens into a life of extreme poverty, leading to a class divide so large that entirely new languages and cultures were developing among the less fortunate. All the while, the more astute individuals began to develop a sense of such superiority that they took the initiative to slowly gate all forms of contemporary education from their inferior counterparts in an effort to even further disable their ability to advance socially, and, well, you probably get the point by now. Expectations are everything, which is why subverting them can sometimes be a bad idea, especially towards the beginning of a game. The player usually knows what they want when going into it, so if you're completely flipping that on its head, don't expect everyone to be happy about it. It's the same reason you watch a certain genre of movie when you're in a certain mood. However, even with as many expectations as you can get, there's still another factor at play here. The sunk cost fallacy is defined as our tendency to continue with something we've invested money, effort, or time into, even if the current costs outweigh the benefits. Just as there are many things that make us quit within the first hour, there are also plenty of things that make us feel like we have to push through it. The sunk cost fallacy is sort of a term that encompasses all of these reasons. For example, you may have spent quite a bit of cash on the game, making you feel like you need to keep playing to get your money's worth. This also means that free games have the absolute lowest incentive to keep playing in this regard, other than, I guess, the time you spent downloading them. Speaking of time, how much of it do you have free? Obviously, people with less free time are less willing to put up with what some may call bullshit. Your life situation can dictate a lot about how much time you can actually dedicate to gaming in general, making you more likely to stick with something you know you like instead of trying something new. On the other side of the coin, you may have so much time dedicated to a series or franchise already that you think that stopping now would mean losing all that you worked for up until that point. This is a really common problem among MMORPG players, since almost every one of those games are designed to be expanded upon over the course of years, sometimes even decades. People invest significant portions of their life into this singular game, so when the next huge expansion launches, no matter how bad it may be, they still trudge through the hours of subpar content in order to get to the quote-unquote good stuff. This can even make it extremely difficult for anyone to bring any new players into the game. What the hell is your friend gonna think when they tell you they don't really like the game you recommended to them and you look them straight in the eye and say,
"Come on, man, stick with it. It gets really good after 40 hours. Then what the f are the first 39 hours there for?"
Obviously, in any of these cases, it's likely that the first hour of the game isn't that great anyway. If it was, you wouldn't have had those thoughts in the first place. There's no need to keep lying to yourself. It's okay. I won't tell anyone that you spent $60 on a sports game for the 8th year in a row. So, what should the first hour even look like? What's the best case scenario? The answer to that is obviously going to be different depending on the type of game, but there are plenty of ground rules to follow, some of which I've already touched on a bit, and these rules can be applied to any genre, and even compared across genres. I want to start by highlighting a very popular method of grabbing the player's attention right at the beginning of the game, and that is starting off with a bang. It's a strategy as old as time that is in no way exclusive to games. Wave something flashy right in front of the player's face, whether that be explosions, colorful graphical displays, or an amazing view. You just need something to show them what they're in for. Similarly, games often give the player a taste of the power they could have if they decide to commit to the game after the opening, and then stripping that power away after the initial sequence. This can be a great way to grab the player's attention, but it is exactly what it is, a novelty. Your extravagant opening means nothing if you can't continue to deliver after the fact. In my opinion, BioShock is a great example of a game that avoids this pitfall with flying colors. The game begins with the player being a victim of a plane crash directly into the open ocean. You surface from the water and are surrounded by flames, with pieces of the plane slowly sinking into the depths below. You'd think you were basically guaranteed to die at this point, but nearby lies a huge stone lighthouse that you can swim to for safety. Though safety probably isn't the best word here. Once you enter this tower, the door slams behind you and the lights turn on, revealing a giant statue with a banner that reads, "No gods or kings, only man." This phrase alone is extremely intriguing and sets the tone for the bit of exposition that comes next. After advancing further into the tower, the player enters a capsule that lowers them deep into the waters below. It is here that we're shown a short video explaining the motivations of one Andrew Ryan. He believes that every person should only be bound by their own free will, independent from the shackles of politics, religion, and societal norms. So he created the recluse underwater city of Rapture, an embodiment of capitalism in the absolute purest form possible. The reveal of this city is grand and awe-inspiring, and the illusion of utopia is still somewhat present during the ride in this capsule, but that quickly changes.
Societal collapse. Who could have seen that coming? Probably whoever's narrating right now.
I mean, it'd be kind of weird if I didn't.
See?
As soon as you finish the ride, you watch a guy get murdered by some deranged lunatic, then pick up a radio with some mysterious dude who explains things to you as you go, and the game just begins, just like that. All of this happens in under 10 minutes and manages to keep your attention the entire time. It doesn't linger on anything for too long, doesn't explain things that don't need to be explained, it just cuts right to the chase. That's the essence of starting off with a bang the right way. If we return back to Mario and Luigi Dream Team, it also starts off with a bang, throwing you into a battle with the main villain Phantasma almost right off the bat. Even within this fight, however, you're interrupted with a tutorial on how to battle, which is admittedly optional, but you still have to trudge through multiple text boxes to even decline the explanation. On top of this, I'm honestly pretty confident that if you didn't even have this tutorial at all, any new player could very easily figure out how to use the jump command, especially with the on-screen button prompts that are already present. You would just need to add small indicators for the action commands for increasing jump damage. This fight is over as quickly as it begins, and you're then thrown into an introductory sequence that just drags on for way too long, explaining the most absolutely basic of concepts as if they're advanced calculus. And to top it all off, it's fluffed out even more with tons of unnecessary dialogue, mostly in association with the pointless tutorials. The difference here is that the momentum is absolutely killed as soon as the exciting part concludes. While the arrival at Pillow Island could spark some interest in the player, the way it's executed just doesn't hold any attention, at least for me. With BioShock, it felt more like a seamless transition because the switch in pacing wasn't nearly as jarring, and the tutorials were very much minimalized. That probably helped as well. To play the game, look at the screen.
I don't get it.
Alternatively, it's also just as valid to pass on the grand opening altogether and literally just start the game. This is especially common in games with less of a focus on story, or at least storytelling in the more literal sense. Celeste is a good example of this. While still having an overarching story with a standard plot and character arcs, the opening is pretty bare bones, essentially just throwing you right in after a couple lines of text. Some games may just stop with the storytelling after this, which is entirely fine, but Celeste chooses to use the power of mystery to its advantage here. The intentions of the main protagonist, Madeline, aren't exactly clear from the start, but throughout the game you slowly learn of her motivations for climbing the mountain, and watch her overcome her issues through a very metaphorical method of storytelling. All the beginning does, however, is plant that seed, and keeps the focus on what the game is mostly about, the platforming. Celeste and BioShock are but two examples of games with great openings and a vast sea of others that I just don't have time to cover. But if we take a step back and look at everything I've said here, with the opening of a game you have two options. You either just let the player, play the game, get them into the thick of it as fast as possible, or you choose to have some sort of exposition beforehand, whether that be a big shocking introduction or slow humble beginnings. With this option, you have to give the player something to care about though, and you have to deliver said exposition in a digestible manner. This is definitely much more difficult to execute than the former approach, but can pay off big time. If someone's invested, you've got them hooked, which means they're more likely to stick with the game, even when it may not be as great as it was when it started. What you shouldn't do, however, is have the player start off a Zelda game by herding a bunch of stupid goats for absolutely no reason.
It's supposed to help you get used to riding the horse, dummy. So you're telling me they thought moving livestock was the best way to do that?
What I've touched on so far only covers, at most, the first 15 minutes though. We've still got the entire rest of that hour that's just as important, and this is when we start to get into the more specific rules of thumb. The most obvious thing you should do after the initial opening sequence is introduce the player to the mechanics of the game. Now, I've already mentioned how this can be easily screwed up with badly executed tutorials, but let's dive a bit deeper into that. In my opinion, the number one thing to keep in mind when it comes to tutorials is to show, not tell. I don't want to read walls of text just to learn how to play something that I'm meant to be enjoying during my leisure time. Sure, I'll read it if I absolutely have to, because sometimes it's the only real option for conveying complex mechanics to the player, but I would argue that 95% of the time, that's just not the case. If your battle system is extremely in-depth and has something that is very difficult to visually convey to the player, then it's fine to have some text. But if you're explaining what a power-up does instead of just letting me pick it up and see for myself, then there's a problem. Even then, in some cases, not all mind you, voice acting can be an amazing alternative way to convey mechanics in a tutorial setting. Little Big Planet does exactly this in a charming and enjoyable way. Many of the game's tutorials are delivered via a disembodied narrator during gameplay, most of the time accompanied with a video. The narrator himself is written with a ton of personality and conveys game mechanics in ways that are neither boring nor patronizing. We've really set the bar low here.
Our games don't treat you like a f***ing idiot. Yeah!
And the best part about this is that for most of these tutorials, if you don't want or don't need to sit and watch the instructional videos, then you can just run right past them, giving the player a choice. Imagine that. When it comes to tutorials, bottom line, keep it as short as possible. Introduce mechanics within the context of the game instead of via text as often as you can, and please have some common sense when it comes to what the player really needs to be taught. So what else should the rest of the first hour have? We've already got a gripping story introduction and exceptional tutorials. What else could we possibly want? Well, in my opinion, there's still one more thing that the preliminary 60-minute duration needs to really sink its teeth into the player and keep them there, slowly bleeding through the bite wound, yearning for more. Now, this may sound pretty obvious, but the player needs a goal, a motivation. Why are they even doing this in the first place? This could either be done through the establishment of an antagonist or antagonistic force that the player is encouraged to stop, or simply through the intrinsic motivation of completing every objective in the game. The latter is far more common in games that have little to no story for obvious reasons, and player retention is purely based on how well the game evolves on its central mechanic throughout that first hour. But let's dive a bit further into the story approach. For this, I want to return to the first Xenoblade game, since it contains what is probably my absolute favorite example of motivating the player to press on from the very beginning. However, my explanation will contain a small spoiler that pops up within the first hour of gameplay, so if you care about that, then I guess plug your ears or something. Shortly after the first dungeon of the game, a mechanical species known as the Mechon launch an all-out attack against Colony 9, the hometown of the game's main protagonist, Shulk. As Shulk and many others fight to defend their colony from the attack, the battle eventually comes to a head when Shulk's childhood friend and love interest Fiora confronts one of the Mechon leaders, Metalface. Shockingly, Metalface ends up brutally murdering Fiora in cold blood, absolutely destroying any semblance of plot armor you thought the game might have, considering she was a member of the party all the way up until this point. Afterwards, we're treated to the classic line from Shulk masterfully demonstrating his unquantifiable hatred towards the Mechon that was only amplified with Fiora's murder. I'll kill you! Now, I don't know about you, but this also made me really pissed off at those stupid robots. After that, I wanted to track Metalface down and rip him off limb by mechanical limb, and the game uses that to its advantage, dangling that sweet, sweet revenge right in front of your face multiple times throughout the journey, constantly motivating you to keep pushing. Now, if instead the motivation for Shulk to leave Colony 9 in search of the Mechon was just because they're so evil and mean, then I wouldn't have cared nearly as much. With the murder and pillaging of your hometown, it's personal, and definitely one way to go about getting the player's attention. It kinda reminds me of that one time my old buddy Frank got my attention by breaking into my house.
What the hell are you doing? You weren't answering your phone.
At the end of the day, there are so many ways to make the first hour of a game great, and I've only covered a few of the numerous examples available in that department. However, in a general sense, I do think I've gotten my idea of the fundamental ground rules across. At the absolute most primitive level, just think of it like this. A good game is a game that is fun. I know, really philosophical, right?
Finally done blinking. I really needed that. Where the hell do you come from?